So picture exactly where you are right now. Like today is April 10th, 2026.
Right.
And the entire global economy is just, well, collectively holding its breath. Because, just 2 days ago, this incredibly fragile ceasefire was announced.
Yeah, in the middle of a really sprawling, catastrophic conflict in the Middle East.
Exactly. And today, like right at this very moment, there are crucial negotiations beginning in Islamabad to figure out if that ceasefire will actually hold.
Or, if global markets are just going to completely tip into free fall, because we are sitting at a massive historical inflection point here.
We really are.
I mean, the decisions being made today, they're going to completely rewire global supply chains for the next 50 years easily.
Yeah, and to understand how we got here, we're going to use this brilliant, brand new academic paper to map it all out and mathematically predict what happens next, actually.
Which is fascinating.
It is. The paper is by Dr. Friednoven, and it was published in the Global Review. It's called Dual Crisis and Strategic Realignment in the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council.
A bit of a mouthful, but yeah.
Right, but before we really jump into this deep dive, I do want to make something perfectly clear to you listening.
Yeah, this is important.
We are looking strictly at the structural economics, the game theory, and the supply chain mechanics of this crisis. Because, look, the text covers some highly charged military events.
Right. Specifically, the U.S.-Israeli campaign against Iran, what they're calling Operation Epic Fury, and, of course, Iran's subsequent actions.
Exactly. So I want to be crystal clear.
Yeah.
We're not taking sides here.
Right.
We're not endorsing any political viewpoints from the left or the right.
Absolutely not.
Our sole mission today is to impartially break down the geopolitical math of the fallout, just to understand the mechanics.
Because that structural math is exactly what dictates the price of a tomato in Berlin or, a gallon of gas in Chicago.
Which brings us right to you, the listener. If you've noticed your grocery bills inexplicably spiking over the last month.
Oh, yeah. Everyone's noticing that.
Right. Or if your retirement portfolio is just acting completely erratically, well, this deep dive is going to reveal the exact hidden global supply chains that are causing it.
So we should probably start with the immediate shockwave.
Let's do it. So, February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury launches. And Iran's immediate response was to close the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, and the fallout from that was just instantaneous. I mean, the International Energy Agency categorized it as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market.
Wow. The largest in history.
In history, the Dallas Fed calculated that nearly 20% of the entire global oil supply simply, poof, vanished from the market overnight.
20%. That is just, we watched Brent crude instantly shoot past $120 a barrel.
Yeah, because the global market physically cannot absorb a 20% haircut in supply, not without these cascading systemic failures across basically every industrial sector.
Okay, but let's unpack this a bit, because the paper actually pivots pretty hard away from the oil markets.
It does, yeah.
The author points out that for the Gulf Cooperation Council, so, the GCC states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, for them, this isn't an energy story at all.
No, it's a survival story, pure and simple.
Right. And what's the mechanism there?
Well, the blind spot is that the global north really only views the GCC as an exporter. We completely ignore what they're actually forced to import.
Okay. Import like what?
Food. The geography of the Persian Gulf means these nations import 80% of their total caloric intake.
Wait, 80%?
80%. And almost all of those food imports come right through the exact same Strait of Hormuz that the oil goes out of. So when the strait closed, the food literally just stopped arriving.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, within 30 days, consumer prices for basic staples across the Gulf spiked anywhere from 40 to 120%.
It's terrifying. It's like, okay, think of the Strait of Hormuz, like the single massive power cord running a giant high-tech server farm in the middle of a desert.
Oh, that's a really good way to look at it.
Right. Because when someone unplugs that cord, it doesn't just stop the oil from leaving the building. It shuts off the cooling systems. It shuts off the water supply coming into the building that keeps those servers from physically melting down.
And the water aspect of your server farm analogy is terrifyingly literal here. Because the Iranian strikes deliberately targeted desalination plants. Places like Kuwait and Qatar, they rely on desalination for 99% of their drinking water.
99%. They have no backup.
No, they don't have natural rivers or massive aquifers to fall back on. So within weeks of the Strait closing, you aren't just looking at a fiscal crisis where a state is, losing its oil revenue.
Right.
You are staring down the barrel of an absolute humanitarian disaster. There's no food coming in, and the literal machinery that creates drinking water has been destroyed.
I hear that, but I have to be honest, I struggle to buy this sort of total vulnerability narrative.
Really?
Well, I mean, these states have trillion-dollar sovereign wealth funds, right? Like the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority alone is just massive. You can literally buy a backup plan for food and water with that kind of money.
I think so, yeah.
So why wouldn't they just stockpile? How do they get caught so exposed?
That's a great question, but the reality is you can stockpile cash, sure, and you can stockpile non-perishable grain for a few months. But you physically cannot stockpile enough drinking water for 30 million people in a desert environment. Evaporation rates, the sheer volume of storage tanks you would require, it basically defies the laws of physics and civil engineering. They are forced to produce water in real time every single day.
Every single day. Yeah.
And Dr. Novin's text explains that this vulnerability isn't just some modern oversight. It was methodically, structurally built over a century.
Right. He breaks this down into 3 distinct historical arcs of fragility, doesn't he?
Exactly.
So the first arc he identifies is colonial fragmentation. This runs from roughly 1916 to 1971, and he points to the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the whole British protectorate era.
Yeah, under colonial administration, imperial powers drew these totally artificial borders. They created distinct customs territories where none had actually existed before.
Which messes up regional trade.
Oh, completely. But more importantly, they designed the physical infrastructure to look outward. Rail lines, roads, banking systems. They weren't built to facilitate trade between neighboring Arab cities.
Right. They were built to extract resources.
Exactly. Extract them, ship them straight to the ports, and put them onto ships headed for Europe. It institutionalized an outward-facing economy.
So even today, that structure remains.
Yeah, even in 2026, trade between GCC neighbors is just negligible compared to what they export globally.
Wow. So they were basically engineered to be fragmented, which perfectly sets up the second arc from the text, which is called the rentier paradox.
Right, spanning from 1973 to 2014, the era of the massive oil boom.
Right. And this is where the domestic vulnerability really gets locked in, doesn't it?
It does. The oil wealth created this rentier state system. The state essentially buys absolute political compliance from its citizens by providing immense welfare.
Free housing, free education, guaranteed high-paying public sector jobs.
Exactly. But to actually build the skyscrapers, to run the ports, to do the hard, productive labor of a functioning country, they rely entirely on the kafala sponsorship system.
And we hear about the kafala system a lot, but I think the mechanics of it are crucial to understanding this specific crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
Because a migrant worker's legal visa status is tied entirely to one single employer. They can't just quit and find another job if conditions get bad.
Right.
It creates this hyper-cheat captive labor pool of roughly 30 million people, right? Mostly from South Asia.
Yeah, 30 million. And think about what that does economically. It completely removes any incentive for the state or private businesses to invest in, citizen-led automation or high-tech productivity.
Or domestic agriculture.
Exactly. Why invent an automated farming system when you can import human labor for literal pennies?
So the rentier paradox systematically decoupled the local citizens from the actual productivity of their own economy.
That is exactly what happened.
Okay, so then we hit the third arc, security dependence. This one runs from 1990 up to 2025, and this stems from that famous 1945 oil for security bargain between the U.S. and the region, right?
Yeah, the deal was very straightforward. The GCC provides the world with a steady flow of oil, and the U.S. military acts as the guarantor of hard security.
They were the bodyguard.
The bodyguard, exactly, protecting those outward-facing trade routes. And because they had a superpower bodyguard, the GCC never really had to build indigenous, robust defense capabilities that could unilaterally protect the strait.
But then the geopolitical math changed.
Drastically. The U.S. shale revolution meant America was suddenly pumping its own oil. They didn't critically need Middle Eastern crude anymore.
While at the exact same time, China rose to become the biggest buyer of Persian Gulf oil.
Right. It's the ultimate geopolitical trap.
Let me make sure I've got this. Their military patron, the U.S., no longer needed their main export. And their new economic patron, China, was buying all their oil, but utterly refused to provide a military umbrella to protect the shipping lanes.
You nailed it. So the GCC spent the last decade frantically hedging between Washington and Beijing, just hoping they wouldn't have to choose.
I have to play devil's advocate here again regarding this timeline, though.
Go for it.
Because anyone who follows international business news has seen the massive PR campaigns for things like Saudi Vision 2030 or the UAE Centennial 2071.
Sure, they've been everywhere.
Right. So weren't these countries aggressively diversifying away from this exact oil dependency over the last 10 years? I mean, they've been spending billions on it.
Well, the 2014 oil price crash was certainly a wake-up call for them, and the ambition of Vision 2030 was very real. But structural reality moves much slower than ambition.
Okay.
The paper actually highlights a truly devastating statistic. As of 2025, so right before this crisis hit, oil still accounted for 75% of Saudi Arabia's fiscal revenue. 75%.
Yeah. So despite a decade of flashy mega projects, robot-run cities, and all that diversification rhetoric, the structural dependence on oil exports and food imports was fundamentally intact when Operation Epic Fury kicked off.
Which brings us right back to today, April 10th, 2026.
Right.
So we have this fragile 2-week ceasefire announced 48 hours ago. The strait is only partially open, and both sides are just heavily accusing each other of violations.
It's extremely tense.
Very. And the paper introduces a fascinating concept here to explain how the GCC is navigating this exact chaos. Bayesian game theory.
Yeah, this is where the math really comes into play. It's a classical game theory. Think of the prisoner's dilemma. It usually assumes everybody knows the rules, everybody knows the payouts, and everybody knows what cards the other players are holding.
Right.
But the GCC right now is operating in a profound fog of war. They are playing with incomplete information. So it's like playing a high-stakes poker game. But instead of just looking at your own hand and playing the math, you're constantly recalculating your odds of winning based on the micro behaviors of the other players at the table.
Exactly.
Like if the player across from you orders a nervous drink or the guy to your left checks his watch, you update your math.
That's a great analogy.
The GCC thought they were playing poker with the U.S., but suddenly they're having to do these Bayesian updates based on the behaviors of an entirely new cast of characters.
And that process of updating your assumptions in game theory is called changing your priors.
Okay. Changing your priors.
Yeah, so let's look at how the GCC is updating their priors regarding the United States right now. Before this crisis, the GCC's prior assumption was that the U.S. would keep the Strait of Hormuz open at literally all costs.
Right. The reliable bodyguard.
But the new signal operation Epic Fury showed the U.S. degrading 66% of Iranian production sites, but utterly failing to protect the GCC's maritime supply routes.
So the GCC's Bayesian update concludes that the U.S. is now what the paper calls a high-cost protector.
Exactly. The bodyguard is perfectly willing to win the fistfight, even if it lets the client's house burn down in the process.
Wow. And then China's behavior forces another massive Bayesian update, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The text categorizes China as the pragmatic stabilizer.
Because they aren't sailing aircraft carriers into the Gulf to open the strait.
No, not at all. Instead, they're pushing their digital Silk Road. They're offering AI integration, 5G networks, smart city infrastructure. They want deep technological leverage and debt diplomacy. They are completely avoiding military entanglement.
It's a completely different value proposition.
Entirely. China is offering economic integration, basically assuming the region will eventually stabilize itself. But the player who actually stepped in to stabilize the region is arguably the most fascinating part of this whole paper.
Yes. This detail honestly stopped me in my tracks, because traditional logic says Washington or European diplomats broker a ceasefire.
Right. Normally, yes.
But the U.S. didn't broker this April 8th agreement. Traditional Arab mediators were entirely absent. It was Pakistan's Army Chief Asim Munir who stepped in. Why Pakistan?
It actually makes perfect sense when you step back and look at the geopolitics. The region is simply too polarized for traditional Arab mediators to step in without being accused of bias by one side or the other.
That makes sense.
So Pakistan is categorized by the text as the surprise mediator. Look at their hand. They are a nuclear-armed, Muslim-majority state with incredibly deep historical military ties to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
But they also share a vital border and huge economic interests with Iran. They possess the exact right geopolitical weight and neutrality to step into a diplomatic vacuum that Washington just couldn't fill.
And we really cannot ignore India's role at this poker table either.
No, India is a massive factor.
Because they aren't negotiating for oil access, right? They're acting as what the paper calls a humanitarian bridge.
Yeah, they are desperately working back channels to protect their 9 million citizens who are trapped under the kafala system, right in the crosshairs of this massive food shortage.
It's just incredible. So the GCC leaders are sitting in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, receiving all these conflicting signals, trying to figure out which global power is actually going to guarantee their survival.
Yeah, and based on this complex Bayesian math, the paper projects 3 potential futures for the years 2026 to 2030.
Right, let's map these out, because the probabilities of these futures just shifted dramatically based on the ceasefire fragility today.
They really did.
So scenario 1 is fragile neutrality. The paper originally gave this a higher probability, but it recently dropped to 50% because the ceasefire is just so shaky.
Yeah, so in scenario 1, the talks happening today in Islamabad actually succeed. The Strait of Hormuz fully reopens, and the GCC, having just stared structural death in the face, fundamentally learns its lesson.
They realize they can't rely on the old system.
Exactly. They furiously pivot their sovereign wealth funds away from those flashy real estate projects, and they dump everything into survival tech.
Like what?
Domestic agriculture, heavily fortified and redundant desalination plants, and huge strategic grain reserves. If they pull off this pivot, the paper projects a solid regional GDP growth of 3.5 to 4.0% by 2027.
Okay, but if today's talks in Islamabad collapse, we fall right into scenario 2, which is Western realignment, and that sits at a 25% probability.
Right.
In this one, the ceasefire shatters, and the GCC feels they have zero choice but to formally align with a U.S.-led security bloc just to force the strait open.
And the economic cost of that alignment is absolutely brutal.
Why?
Because if the GCC formally aligns with the U.S. coalition that launched the war, China will likely pull back its investments immediately. They'll aggressively accelerate their own energy diversification toward Russia or Africa.
So the GCC loses its single biggest customer.
Overnight, economic growth plummets to maybe 1.8 to 2.5%. And countries with weaker fiscal buffers, like Bahrain and Oman, they face catastrophic sovereign debt crises.
I think the text notes Bahrain's debt is already projected to hit nearly 140% of its GDP, right?
Yes. They physically cannot survive the loss of the Chinese market. It would break them.
Which brings us to the nightmare. Scenario 3, systemic reset. This holds the final 25% probability.
This is the really dark one.
Yeah. The war expands regionally, desalination infrastructure is repeatedly targeted, and the kafala system completely collapses. You have 30 million migrant workers facing imminent starvation, desperately trying to flee a war zone.
And the economic contraction from that would be instantaneous. I mean, the paper models a devastating 8% drop in GDP for the region in 2026 alone.
8%?
Yeah. Just imagine every construction site, every hospital, every logistics hub, and every hospitality business simply stopping overnight because the labor force has vanished.
That is catastrophic. But I have to challenge the long-term view of this.
Okay, how so?
Is it possible that scenario 3, this incredibly painful, catastrophic 8% GDP contraction, is actually the best possible long-term outcome for the GCC?
That's a bold claim.
Well, think about it. If the kafala system breaks entirely, doesn't it brutally force these nations to abandon their century-old structural dependency? They'd be forced to build a highly productive, automated, citizen-led economy literally overnight just to survive.
You're touching on the exact mechanism of how deep crises force innovation, and it raises the really critical question of capital deployment here.
Right, the sovereign wealth funds.
Yeah, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority has roughly $1 trillion. The Saudi Public Investment Fund has around $700 billion. The paper suggests that in scenario 3, the era of the prestige giga-project immediately dies.
Because you don't build a 100-mile-long mirrored city in the desert if you have zero migrant labor to construct it and no food to feed the architects.
Exactly. And in fact, the paper explicitly points out that construction on the line in Saudi Arabia's NEOM development has already been suspended due to this crisis.
Has it really? Wow.
Yeah. So those trillions of dollars get forcefully, violently redirected into pure survival technologies. We are talking about massive, unprecedented investments in blue and green hydrogen infrastructure.
And just to clarify those mechanics for the listener quickly, green hydrogen means using their massive, unending solar capacity to separate hydrogen from water. Right.
Right.
Basically, literally creating a sustainable energy export out of sunlight. And blue hydrogen uses natural gas but captures the carbon.
Exactly. So they pivot to becoming the world's renewable energy superpower while simultaneously building AI-driven logistics and next-generation climate-controlled agricultural tech.
Wow.
So in a very twisted, very painful way, Scenario 3 forces the GCC to actually achieve the lofty goals of Vision 2030, not by careful design, but by absolute brutal necessity.
That is just fascinating. So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
Right.
Why should someone outside the Middle East care about Bayesian game theory or the fiscal dent policies of Bahrain?
Well, it matters because this crisis proves that in the 21st century, vast wealth does not equal systemic resilience.
Exactly. The old oil for security world order is officially dead.
It's gone.
And we are watching the real-time birth of a new global architecture that isn't being brokered by superpowers in Washington, but by middle powers like Pakistan and India out of pure necessity.
And it really exposes the hidden wiring of our daily lives, too.
Yeah. High oil prices might generate billions in windfall profits for the GCC in the short term, but if those exact same high prices destroy the global supply chains for the fertilizers needed to grow our food or the high-tech components needed for our devices, everyone loses.
The vulnerabilities are entirely shared across the globe. I mean, the text notes that 30% of globally traded fertilizers transit right through the Strait of Hormuz.
30%.
Yeah, so when that stops, the cost of growing a tomato in Europe or harvesting grain in the Americas skyrockets. The world is just far too intertwined to isolate a shock of this magnitude.
It really is. So I want to leave you with one final provocative thought from the source material to mull over today.
This is the part that really stuck with me.
Yeah, we talked about the potential collapse of the kafala system under Scenario 3. Try to imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of 30 million people facing sudden starvation.
It is almost impossible to conceptualize that scale of human movement.
It really is. Think about it. If this fragile ceasefire breaks down today in Islamabad, and those 30 million workers are forced to flee the Gulf, just crowding onto ships and planes, fleeing a waterless war zone back to India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, how does that sudden, massive reverse migration permanently alter the economies, the political stability, and the social fabric of South Asia?
Yeah, you were talking about millions of people returning to countries that rely heavily on the remittances those workers used to send home.
Exactly. We often think of geopolitical economics as a clean binary equation. But we're dealing with constantly updating odds, changing alliances, and systems so deeply intertwined that a ceasefire in Islamabad could literally dictate the price of your groceries next month. Keep questioning the consensus, keep looking at the hidden supply chains, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.